Now that we've seen code sharing in action, I want to go into some of the behind the scenes details to give you a better sense of what's really going on here. So the first thing I want you to understand is that anytime that we use Node.js to execute a JavaScript file, we're not just directly executing the code that you see inside this file. Technically, the code inside this file is being wrapped automatically inside of a function and then executed. So in other words, if we run node index.js right now, Node is going to find all the contents inside the index.js file, and then it's going to wrap it inside of a function. So the function looks like this. It's just a simple function declaration that has some number of arguments. This function is then going to be automatically invoked by Node. What's really important to understand here is the different arguments that are being passed into this function. In total, there are 5 different arguments that are automatically provided. One thing I want to mention is that this process is kind of invisible, and we're never going to really see this function being declared with our own eyes. However, there are some ways that we can kind of detect that it is being placed inside of our code, and I'll show you that in just a moment. I first want to tell you about the 5 different arguments that get passed into this function automatically. The first argument is something called the exports object. This exports object is basically equivalent to the module.exports property that we just saw a moment ago. We can assign different variables or functions or objects or whatever else to this exports object to make it available inside of other files. Now, we almost always use module.exports as opposed to this first argument of exports. And the reason is that there's kind of a little corner case around using this exports variable. So to be honest with you, it's best to just kind of forget that this first argument or this exports thing exists altogether. Instead, we kind of just pretend that the only way that we share code between different files is module.exports. That's it. Now, I'm sure as I go into this, that sounds really confusing, but don't worry, I'm going to give you a lot of examples of this very quickly. Let's move on to the second argument. The second argument is require. This is a function that we can use to load up a different file and get access to all the different variables that get exported from it. The third argument is called the module argument. This is an object that defines some different properties about the current file that is being executed. So in the case of, say, the index.js file, that third argument of module would contain some information relevant to the index.js file. The fourth argument is underscore underscore file name. So notice that there are technically 2 underscores right there. This is a string that is the full path plus the file name of that file. And then finally, the last argument is underscore underscore, once again, 2 underscores there, dir name. And this is the full path, like the directory that the current file lives in. Now, I want to show you, or I just mentioned a second ago, that we can kind of detect the presence of these different arguments. So let's go back over to our index.js file, and we're going to make a couple modifications to it. And in doing so, we're going to kind of detect that these different things exist. Okay, so back inside of index.js, I'm going to delete the code I have inside of here right now, and I'm going to replace it with console.log arguments. Now, you may have learned earlier on inside the course that we can reference all the arguments that are passed to a function by just declaring this special variable arguments. So in theory, if our code inside of index.js is being wrapped inside of a function, then arguments should print out these 5 different arguments that I just said were being passed to this kind of imaginary or invisible function. So I'm going to try saving this file. I'm going to go back over to my terminal, and I'll run node index.js once again. And when I do so, I get a big console log here. This console log is kind of hard to read, but we can kind of walk through it and get a sense of what's going on. You'll notice that we have an object, and it has some indices of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 inside of it. So this is really an array of all the different arguments that were passed to this invisible function. The first argument, or 0 right here, is the exports object. And again, we're kind of going to just ignore that that even exists. The second argument is that require function. If we go down a little bit, you'll see the argument at index 2, so the third argument, is that module thing, and this has some information about the current file that is being executed. And then finally, the fourth and fifth arguments are first the file name, which is the full path plus the file name of the file that's being executed, and then finally the dir name, or just the directory that that current file is in. Now, printing all this stuff out with that arguments variable is kind of confusing, so let's just go through very quickly and console log out some of these different individual variables. So I could do a console log of require. Again, we don't really see that function being declared anywhere inside of index.js, but it is technically here because when this code gets executed, we can imagine that a magic function or an invisible function automatically is going to wrap our code. And inside of here, one of the arguments is that require function. Okay, so I'm going to save this, run that file again, and we'll see just that console log of require. So that's the entire console log of the require function. Then we can do the same thing with module. We can save that, run it again, and we see the entire module object. Again, this has some information about the file that is being executed. Then we can do underscore underscore. Again, notice that there are two underscores here. File name. I'll save that and run it again. That's the full path plus the file name of this file. And then finally we can do underscore underscore dir name. Save that, and we'll get just the directory that this file lives in. Now, you might be thinking that understanding or getting access to the file name and the dir name is kind of pointless, but there actually are some really interesting use cases around Node.js where it's very handy to understand the name of the current file or the directory that it's in. For the most part, whenever we are running some Node code, the only really real arguments that we care about that are being passed into each of these different files is, as you might guess, the require function and the module object. Okay, so now that we understand that there's some kind of invisible arguments being passed into each of our different files, let's take another quick pause and we're going to start to focus on how Node actually shares code between these different files through the use of the require function and the module.exports object. So one more quick pause and I'll see you in just a minute.